On a Tuesday morning in late August of 2012, every irrigation pivot in Finney County, Kansas, was running. Not because the farmers wanted to run them, because they had to. The aquifer was dropping, had been dropping for 20 years, and the wheat and corn that defined this county, that had defined this county since before anyone alive could remember, needed water the way a fire needs air. Constant, relentless, without apology. The pivots ran day and night, and the electric meters spun, and the water table fell another fraction of an inch, and nobody said anything about it because what was there to say? This was Finney County. This was what you did. Let me tell you about what it meant to farm in Finney County, Kansas, in the early years of the 21st century, because you need to understand the world before you can understand the woman who tried to change it. The Ogallala Aquifer sits beneath 8 states and roughly 174,000 square miles of the Great Plains. Farmers in western Kansas had been drawing from it since the 1940s, when electric pumps and center pivot irrigation made it possible to turn short grass prairie into some of the most productive cropland in the world. For 60 years, it worked. Wheat went in, corn went in, milo went in, sometimes on the dry years. The yields came out, and the grain elevators filled, and the county roads carried loaded semis from September through November, and life in Garden City had a rhythm to it that felt permanent, felt like gravity, felt like something that had always been and would always be. But the aquifer does not refill the way people want it to. Rainfall in western Kansas, 12 to 18 inches a year on a good year, seeps back into the formation at a rate measured in fractions of inches per decade. The pumps pull it out in feet per year. The math had been bad for a long time, and the farmers knew the math was bad, and they planted wheat and corn anyway, because wheat and corn were what you planted in Finney County, Kansas. Not because anyone sat down and made that decision fresh, because their fathers had planted it, and their fathers' fathers, and the elevators were built for it, and the equipment was bought for it, and the neighbors were doing it, and the county extension agent had a bulletin about it, and the co-op carried the seed for it, and the bank understood it. Tradition isn't a choice. It's a current. You can swim against it, but you'd better have a reason, and you'd better be ready for what people say when you try. The Vega family had farmed 1,800 acres in the eastern part of Finney County for 3 generations. Ernesto Vega, the grandfather, had come up from Chihuahua in 1951 and worked harvests until he'd saved enough to lease 40 acres of his own. By 1970, he owned 300. By the time his son Miguel took over in the late 1980s, the operation had grown to its current size, and Miguel Vega was, by any honest measure, a good farmer. Methodical, careful. He ran a winter wheat rotation with 1/3 of his ground in dryland corn, kept his equipment maintained, watched his input costs, and delivered consistent yields that put him in the top quarter of producers in the county most years. He was not a man who complained. He was not a man who took risks. He was a man who understood that in farming, consistency was survival, and survival was the whole point. His daughter Camille was something else entirely. Let me tell you about Camille Vega, because she is the reason this story exists, and she is different from most of the characters you've heard about on this channel. Different in ways that matter. Camille was 22 years old in the spring of 2012, and she had just finished a degree in agronomy at Kansas State University in Manhattan. Not a general agriculture degree. Agronomy, soil science, crop physiology, water use efficiency, plant genetics. She had spent 4 years studying the relationship between crops and the land they grew in, and in her junior year she had taken a seminar taught by a professor named Dr. Anita Rourke, who had spent 15 years researching alternative grain crops in semi-arid environments, and that seminar had changed the way Camille Vega looked at everything she had grown up knowing. She came home in May with a degree, a notebook full of data, and an idea that she understood would not be well received. She waited until a Sunday evening in June to bring it up. The dishes were cleared. Her father was drinking coffee. Her mother, Rosa, was at the other end of the table with a seed catalog she'd been reading for 20 minutes without turning a page. Camille set the notebook on the table between them and said she wanted to talk about sorghum, not milo. Not the grain sorghum that occasionally showed up in western Kansas rotations as a drought hedge. She was talking about forage sorghum and grain sorghum varieties, specifically bred for low water input, high biomass yield, and deep root architecture. She was talking about replacing a significant portion of the corn acres, the thirstiest acres on the farm, the ones running pivots from June through August, with sorghum varieties that could produce competitive revenue on a fraction of the water. Her father listened. He did not interrupt. When she finished, he picked up his coffee cup, found it empty, set it back down, and said he needed to think about it. Her mother waited until Miguel had gone to check on something in the shop, then looked at Camille across the table and said quietly, "You've got the numbers to back it up?" Camille said she did. Rosa nodded once. "Then show him the numbers." Let me tell you about the science, because this is the part that Camille had spent a year building, and it deserves more than a sentence. Grain sorghum, sorghum bicolor, is one of the most water-efficient cereal crops in commercial agriculture. Where corn requires roughly 25 to 30 inches of water across a growing season to produce competitive yields, well-adapted sorghum varieties can produce comparable grain tonnage on 14 to 18 inches, and some of the newer drought-tolerant lines being trialed in the Texas Panhandle and western Oklahoma were hitting 15 to 20% better water use efficiency than those. The root system is the reason. Sorghum develops a fibrous root architecture that extends 4 to 5 feet deep in well-drained soils, accessing subsoil moisture that corn roots, which tend to concentrate in the top 2 to 3 feet, simply never reach. In a county where the water table was declining and irrigation costs were climbing, electricity to run a center pivot on 160 acres in western Kansas ran between $18,000 and $24,000 per season in 2012. The difference in water demand was not a marginal consideration. It was the whole conversation. Dr. Rourke's research, along with field trials from the Texas A&M AgriLife Research Station in Lubbock and cooperative extension data out of Oklahoma State, showed consistent results across semi-arid environments. In years with below-average precipitation, sorghum maintained 70 to 85% of its yield potential. Corn, under the same conditions without supplemental irrigation, dropped to 30 to 40% of potential. The revenue comparison in a dry year was not close. In a wet year, corn won on yield. In any year where water cost money or wasn't available, sorghum won on net return per acre. Camille had built a spreadsheet comparing the two crops across 10 years of historical weather data for Finney County, applying current input costs, current commodity prices, and current irrigation electricity rates. In 6 of those 10 years, sorghum returned more net revenue per acre than corn. In 3 of the 4 years corn won, the margin was under $40 per acre. In the 1 year corn won decisively, precipitation had been 22 inches, nearly double the county average. She showed her father the spreadsheet on a Thursday evening 2 weeks later. He looked at it for a long time. He asked about the market. Where would he sell it? What elevator took sorghum? What the basis looked like? She had answers for all of it. He asked about equipment. Did they need a different header, different settings on the combine? She had answers for that too. He asked about the neighbors. What would people say? She didn't have an answer for that one, but she told him she thought she knew. Camille Vega looked at the spreadsheet for another minute, then looked at his daughter and said she could plant 120 acres of sorghum on the southeast quarter, the ground that ran the hardest on irrigation because of the sandy soil, and they would see what happened. 1 season. He was not committing to anything beyond that. Camille said that was enough. Now, let me tell you about Ned Crowley, because you cannot understand what happened next without understanding the man who made sure everyone in Finney County knew what the Vega girl was doing with her father's ground. Ned Crowley was 61 years old and had run the Crowley grain and seed operation on the west side of Garden City for 32 years. He was not a farmer himself, not anymore. He'd sold his own ground in 1994 and gone full-time into the input and marketing side. But he knew every farmer in the county by first name, knew their acreage, knew their rotations, knew their debt load in a general way, and had opinions about all of it that he shared freely at the counter of his store, which functioned as an informal clearinghouse for agricultural opinion in western Finney County. If you wanted to know what people were thinking about prices, about weather, about what some farmer out on the east side was supposedly doing with his rotation, you went to Crowley's counter and you listened. Ned held court there every morning from 7 to 9, coffee in hand, and his word carried weight because he'd been there long enough and knew enough that people assumed he was right, even when he wasn't. He heard about Camille Vega's sorghum plan in early July, from a seed salesman who'd been out to the Vega place and seen the field going in. He mentioned it at the counter the next morning to a group of 4 farmers who were waiting on a parts order. He said he'd heard Miguel Vega's daughter had come back from K-State with some idea about planting sorghum on the pivot ground, and that Miguel had apparently let her do it, which was either a father being kind to his daughter or a farmer losing his mind, and he wasn't sure which. The silence lasted about 2 seconds. Then the laughter started. It wasn't cruel laughter. Let me be clear about that, because the nature of the laugh matters. It was the laughter of men who had been doing something a particular way for a long time and found it genuinely funny that someone, especially someone 22 years old, especially someone who'd been farming for 0 seasons on her own, thought she'd found something they'd missed. It was the laughter of certainty, of people who had confused familiarity with knowledge and couldn't feel the difference. Ned Crowley's laugh was the loudest, and it had a particular quality to it, a kind of fond condescension, the way you laugh at a child who tells you something confidently wrong. He said, "Sorghum on pivot ground, in Finney County. Lord." He shook his head. He said the markets weren't there, the buyers weren't set up for it, and that Miguel was going to lose money on that 120 acres, and his daughter was going to learn something they don't teach you at K-State, which was that what works on paper doesn't always work in a field. Word got around. It always does in a county that small. Camille heard what Crowley had said within a week. She heard it from her cousin, who'd heard it from someone at the elevator. She didn't say anything about it at home. She went out to the southeast quarter and walked the rows of sorghum that were already knee-high and dark green in the July heat. and she looked at the pivot that was running at half the hours it would have been running on corn, and she wrote the pump hours down in her notebook, and she went back to the house and updated her spreadsheet. Let me pause here and ask you something. When was the last time you watched someone do the quiet work, the unglamorous, unrewarded, unwitnessed work of just keeping track, and understood that the keeping track was itself the act of courage? Camille Vega was not making speeches. She was not arguing with Ned Crowley. She was writing numbers in a notebook, and those numbers were going to matter more than anything Ned Crowley said at his counter that summer. The 2012 growing season, as it turned out, was not a normal year. It was the worst drought year in the continental United States since 1956. The USDA would eventually designate more than half the counties in the lower 48 as primary disaster areas. In Kansas, precipitation from April through August came in at roughly 55% of the historical average across most of the state. In western Kansas, in Finney County, it was worse. The summer was hot in a way that felt personal. Sustained heat above 100 degrees for stretches of 10 and 12 days, winds out of the southwest that pulled the moisture out of the soil faster than the pivots could put it back, and an aquifer that was already stressed responding to the increased pumping demand the way an overdrawn bank account responds to another withdrawal. The corn in Finney County needed water. The pivots ran. The electricity bills came in and farmers opened them and set them on the kitchen table and didn't say anything. Some of them ran their pivots 24 hours a day for 6 weeks and still watched their corn tip burn and pollinate poorly and set ears that were short and light. The county extension office reported average corn yields for 2012 in western Kansas at roughly 68 bushels per acre, against a normal expectation of 140 to 160 bushels in an irrigated year. Some fields did worse. The corn that had been planted on the sandier ground, the ground that couldn't hold water between irrigation cycles, came in below 50 bushels in places. Miguel Vega's corn, the 600 acres he'd kept in corn on the better watered ground, came in at 79 bushels per acre. He'd pushed his pivots hard and managed his timing well, and he'd done better than most of his neighbors, and it still wasn't a good year. At $6.75 per bushel, corn prices were elevated that year because the drought had tightened supply nationally. He grossed roughly $533 per acre. His input costs, including seed, fertilizer, herbicide, and irrigation electricity, ran to approximately $420 per acre on that ground. He netted about $113 per acre on his corn. In a year when the drought was historic and the commodity price was elevated, he cleared $113 an acre. Let me tell you about what happened on the southeast quarter. Camille's 120 acres of grain sorghum had run the pivot at an average of 11 hours per day during the critical growth stages, compared to the 21 hours per day her father's corn had required on comparable ground in previous years. The sorghum had gone into a mild stress period in late July when temperatures hit 107 degrees for 4 consecutive days, and Camille had watched it carefully, had walked the rows every other morning, had noted the leaf rolling that indicated heat stress and the recovery that came each night when temperatures dropped back to the low 80s. Sorghum is drought avoidant in a way that corn is not. It can suspend growth during extreme stress and resume when conditions improve, rather than taking permanent yield damage the way corn does when it stresses during pollination. The sorghum had stressed. It had recovered. It had set grain. It came in at 87 bushels per acre. in a year when Finney County corn averaged 68 bushels, in a year when the drought was the worst in 2 generations. On the sandiest, hardest to irrigate ground on the Vega operation, the crop that Ned Crowley had laughed about at his counter in July came in at 87 bushels per acre. The price wasn't corn. Grain sorghum, milo, was trading at roughly $6.20 per bushel that fall, a slight discount to corn. Camille's gross revenue was $539 per acre. Her input costs, critically, were substantially lower. No atrazine carryover issues, lower seed cost, and, the number that mattered most, irrigation electricity running to $9,400 for the season on those 120 acres, compared to an estimated $19,200 that the same acreage would have required in corn. Her net revenue per acre, after all inputs, came in at approximately $218 per acre, against her father's $113 per acre on his corn, on the worst drought year in 60 years, on the farm's most difficult ground. The sorghum had netted nearly twice what the corn had. Miguel Vega sat at the kitchen table that October with Camille's numbers in front of him and didn't say anything for a long time. Rosa was at the stove. The kitchen was quiet except for the sound of something simmering. He looked at the per-acre comparison. He looked at the irrigation hours. He looked at the electricity costs. He set the papers down and looked at his daughter across the table and said, "You were right." He said it quietly, not like a man defeated, like a man who had just learned something real and was deciding what to do with it. Then he said, "How much ground do you want next year?" Camille looked at him for a moment. She said, "I think you should let me decide the rotation." He picked up his coffee. He looked out the window at the dark fields. He said, "All right." That was the whole conversation. But if you understood what it meant for Miguel Vega, a man who had farmed 1,800 acres with a consistency that had kept his family solvent for 30 years, a man who did not take risks, a man who had given his daughter 120 acres as a courtesy and been shown something he hadn't known. If you understood what it cost him to say, "all right," to a 22-year-old with a notebook, you would understand that it was one of the most significant things he ever said. Let me tell you about the 2 years that followed, because the story doesn't end with one good harvest. In 2013, Camille expanded the sorghum to 400 acres, split between the sandy southeast ground and 2 other quarters that she'd identified as poor candidates for corn based on soil water holding capacity data she'd pulled from the NRCS Web Soil Survey. She also introduced a cover crop component on 200 acres of the wheat ground, a mix of cereal rye and hairy vetch planted after wheat harvest to build organic matter and reduce erosion over winter. This was not a revenue play. It was a soil investment, and she told her father that clearly. He nodded and said he trusted her. The 2013 season was closer to normal. Precipitation came in at about 85% of average, which in western Kansas still meant dry, but not catastrophically so. The sorghum came in at 102 bushels per acre. The corn, on the better ground, came in at 128 bushels. The per-acre net comparison was closer that year. Corn won on the good ground, as Camille had always acknowledged it would in a favorable year. But the sorghum still netted $171 per acre against corn's $198 on the comparable ground, and on the sandy acres where corn had historically underperformed, the sorghum outperformed corn's 5-year average by $44 per acre. The cover crop ground showed measurable improvement in organic matter at the end of the first year. Not dramatic, but real, and Camille recorded it in the notebook. The community had stopped laughing by the fall of 2013. They hadn't started agreeing, exactly. But the laughter was gone. Farmers drove past the Vega place on County Road 9 and looked at the sorghum fields the way people look at something they don't quite understand but can't dismiss. At the elevator, people asked questions about where the Vega girl was marketing her Milo, what she was getting for basis, whether the combine settings were complicated. These were not the questions of people who were convinced. They were the questions of people who were no longer certain they were right. Ned Crowley, for his part, had gone quiet on the subject. He still held court at his counter every morning. He still had opinions about prices and weather and what various farmers were doing. But when someone brought up the Vega operation, he tended to change the subject or find something that needed his attention in the back. His certainty had not become uncertainty. It had become silence, which in a man like Ned Crowley was a more significant transformation than it might sound. In 2014, Camille was invited to present her data at a Finney County Extension meeting in February. She was 24 years old. She drove to the meeting in her father's truck, wearing a Carhartt jacket and a cap with the seed company logo on it that she'd gotten at the co-op, and she stood at the front of a room with 43 farmers in it and put her spreadsheet on the projector and walked them through 3 years of per-acre data, water use comparisons, input cost breakdowns, and aquifer drawdown rates correlated with irrigation hours by crop type. She was not nervous. She had been carrying these numbers for 2 years. She knew them the way a person knows the layout of a house they grew up in the dark, by feel, without having to think about it. She said the problem in western Kansas was not that farmers were bad at farming. She said the problem was that the system, the crops, the equipment, the elevators, the financing, the entire infrastructure of western Kansas agriculture had been built around an aquifer that was not going to last, and that every year of corn on pivot ground was a year of drawing down a resource that could not be replaced on any time scale that mattered to anyone in the room. She said she wasn't telling them to stop farming. She was telling them that the farming they were doing was going to stop them, eventually, and that the question was whether they wanted to make the transition on their own terms or wait until the water made the decision for them. She put up the 2012 numbers. The drought year, the year her sorghum had netted $218 per acre on ground, where her father's corn had netted $113. She let the room look at those numbers for a moment. Then she said, "I'm not here to tell you sorghum is better than corn. I'm here to tell you that any farm that grows only one thing needs only one disaster to fail. And the disaster in western Kansas isn't coming. It's already here. We're just pumping our way through it." The room was quiet. Her father was sitting in the third row. He had driven himself to the meeting without telling Camille he was coming. When she finished, he stood up. He didn't say anything. He just stood up, and the farmers around him looked at him, and then they started clapping, and Miguel Vega stood there with his arms at his sides and his face doing something complicated that was not quite a smile and not quite something else. Let me tell you about the morning Ned Crowley drove out to the Vega place, because it is the part of this story that people who were there still talk about. It was a Thursday in March of 2015. Camille was in the shop going through planting equipment when she heard a truck on the gravel. She came out and saw Ned Crowley's green pickup sitting in the yard, and Ned getting out of it with his hands in his jacket pockets, looking at the ground the way a man looks at the ground when he's not sure how to start a conversation. He was 64 years old. He had been selling seed and grain inputs in Finney County for 35 years. He had 3 customers who had come to him in the past month asking about sorghum varieties, asking about water use efficiency, asking questions he didn't have good answers to, and he had decided, and this decision had cost him something, she could see it in the way he was standing, that he needed to talk to someone who did. Camille wiped her hands on a shop rag and waited. Ned said he'd been hearing a lot of questions lately that he didn't know how to answer, and he thought maybe she could help him understand what she was doing out here and why it was working. Camille looked at him for a moment. She said, "Ned, do you remember what you said at your counter in July of 2012 about sorghum on pivot ground in Finney County?" He said he probably said a lot of things in 2012. She said, "You said the markets weren't there, the buyers weren't set up for it, and that my father was going to lose money on that 120 acres. You said I was going to learn something they don't teach at K-State." He didn't say anything. She said, "You were right about one thing. I did learn something they don't teach at K-State." She paused. "I learned that the people who've been doing something the longest are sometimes the last ones to see when it stops working." She wasn't angry when she said it. Her voice was level. She was not interested in humiliating him. She was interested in the thing she'd been interested in since she came home from Manhattan with a notebook full of data, which was whether the farming in Finney County was going to survive the next 30 years or whether it was going to pump itself dry and leave the county a different kind of empty. She told him to come inside and she'd show him the numbers. He followed her into the kitchen. Rosa made coffee without being asked. Camille got out the notebook, 3 years of it now, thick with data and annotations and the careful record of what had happened on those 120 acres, and then 400 acres, and then 700 acres, and she put it on the table in front of him and walked him through it the same way she'd walked her father through it 3 years earlier. He asked good questions. She had good answers. They talked for 2 hours. When he left, he shook her hand at the door and said he appreciated her time. He did not apologize. She hadn't expected him to. Some things are too large and too close for a person to apologize for directly. You can only change what you do next and hope the change speaks for itself. In the spring of 2015, Crowley Grain and Seed began stocking 3 varieties of drought-tolerant grain sorghum and 1 forage sorghum variety. Ned ran a small ad in the county paper. He started carrying the University of Kansas water use efficiency bulletins at his counter, alongside the corn seed catalogs. When farmers asked him about alternatives to full pivot corn, he told them to go talk to Camille Vega. He said it without irony. He said it like a recommendation. Let me tell you about what the next 5 years looked like, because the story of one farm is really the story of a county, and the county was changing. By 2017, 11 farms in Finney County had incorporated sorghum into their rotations in a meaningful way, not as a token hedge, but as a deliberate water management strategy. The county extension office had partnered with Kansas State to run a formal multi-farm trial comparing water use efficiency across crop types, and Camille was on the advisory committee. She was 27 years old and sitting at a table with agronomists and county officials and farmers who had been working this ground since before she was born, and she was the one they looked at when the conversation turned to data. The Vega operation had expanded its sorghum to 900 acres by 2017, with the remaining ground in winter wheat and a small trial of dryland grain sorghum, no irrigation at all, on 80 acres in the far eastern corner of the property, where the soil was deepest and the subsoil moisture most reliable. The dryland trial came in at 54 bushels per acre in its first year. Not spectacular, but it cost $87 per acre to produce, and it required no water from the aquifer, and on a farm where the aquifer was the existential question, 54 bushels for $87 of inputs and zero irrigation was a number worth writing down. The aquifer in the region was still declining. That was not going to stop. The drawdown had slowed slightly in the areas where farmers had reduced irrigation intensity, but the formation was overdrawn across its range, and the physics of the situation were not negotiable. What was negotiable was the rate of decline, and the farms that were managing water deliberately were extending the usable life of their irrigation capacity by years, possibly decades. The USDA Natural Resources Conservation Service had begun citing the Finney County sorghum adoption data in regional water management reports. Camille's name appeared in 2 of them. In the fall of 2018, she was asked to speak at the High Plains Aquifer Conference in Wichita. She drove down with her father, who sat in the front row of a conference room with 200 people in it, and watched his daughter stand at a podium and explain, with 3 years of multi-farm trial data behind her, what the relationship between crop choice and aquifer sustainability looked like in real numbers. She was 30 years old. She had been farming her father's ground for 8 years. She had a notebook that had grown into a filing cabinet of data, and she stood at that podium the way a person stands when they have been right about something for a long time and have the records to prove it. Camille Vega sat in the front row and did not say anything during the talk. At the end, when the room applauded, he stood up again, the same way he had stood at the extension meeting in 2014. Just stood. The man next to him, a farmer from Haskell County he'd never met, leaned over and asked if he knew the speaker. Miguel said yes. The man asked how. Miguel said, "She's my daughter." He said it the way you say something that you have been proud of for a long time and are only now finding the right moment to say out loud. Let me tell you about the morning in the spring of 2020 when Camille's daughter, 8 years old, came into the kitchen before school with a library book about hemp production and put it on the table next to her mother's coffee and said she'd been reading about it and thought they should try some on the Far East Quarter. Camille looked at the book. She looked at her daughter. She looked at the page the book was open to, which showed a hemp plant's root architecture. Deep, fibrous, penetrating, and the water use comparison table beside it. She picked up the book. She read the page. She set it back down. She said, "Tell me what you're thinking." Her daughter sat down across from her and started talking, the way children talk when they've been thinking about something for a long time and have finally found the moment to say it. She talked about the root system. She talked about the fiber market. She talked about something she'd read about soil carbon and how hemp residue broke down differently than cereal straw. She had questions she didn't have answers to yet, and she said so, and she said she thought they should find out. Camille listened to all of it. When her daughter finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You know what people are going to say." Her daughter looked at her across the table with the particular steadiness of a child who has grown up watching her mother be right about something everyone else thought was wrong, and she said, "I know, but the numbers will be the numbers." Camille looked at her for a long moment. She thought about a Tuesday morning in June of 2012, sitting at this same table with a notebook and a spreadsheet and a father who wasn't sure. She thought about 120 acres on the southeast quarter and a pivot running at half the hours it should have needed. She thought about Ned Crowley's laugh and what it had meant, and what it had cost him to drive out here 8 years later and sit in this kitchen and ask questions he should have been asking in 2012. She picked up her coffee. She said, "All right. Now let me tell you one last thing, because this is the part of the story that doesn't have a tidy ending, and the part that matters most. Camille Vega still farms those 1,800 acres in eastern Finney County, Kansas. The sorghum is still in the rotation. The dryland trial has expanded to 200 acres. The cover crop ground has measurably better organic matter than it did in 2012. Not dramatically, but measurably, which in farming is the same as dramatically because it compounds. The aquifer beneath her ground is still declining, because the aquifer beneath all of western Kansas is still declining, and one farm's choices cannot reverse a regional physics problem. But the rate of drawdown on the Vega irrigation wells has slowed. The pump hours are down. The electricity bills are lower. The net revenue per acre, averaged across the operation over the past 8 years, is higher than it was when every acre was in corn and wheat and the pivots ran day and night. Ned Crowley retired in 2019. At his retirement party at the VFW Hall in Garden City, he made a short speech. He talked about 35 years of farming relationships and what the county had meant to him. Near the end, he said there was one thing he'd gotten wrong in his career that he wanted to acknowledge, and he said the name Camille Vega, and he said she had been right before anyone was willing to listen, and that he wished he had listened sooner. It was the closest thing to an apology he had in him, and the room was quiet when he said it, and Camille, who was sitting at a table near the back, nodded once and looked at her hands. The notebook from 2012 is still on the shelf in the Vega farmhouse kitchen. It's been joined by 7 others. The first one has a coffee ring on the cover from a Sunday evening in June, when a 22-year-old woman sat across from her father and tried to explain something she knew was true, and he wasn't ready to hear yet. The pages are full of pump hours and yield numbers and per-acre calculations, and the careful, patient record of what happens when you decide to find out whether what everyone does is actually the best thing to do. The aquifer doesn't read the sign on your county extension office. It doesn't know what Finney County has always planted. It doesn't care about tradition or certainty or what Ned Crowley said at his counter in July of 2012. It just goes down, one fraction of an inch at a time, and the farms that are going to survive the next 50 years are the ones that understood that before the water made the decision for them. Camille Vega planted sorghum in a corn county. They laughed. The drought came. The corn faltered. The sorghum held. The numbers told the story that the laughter had tried to drown out. And the notebook on the kitchen shelf is thicker every year, because the questions don't stop, and neither does the work of finding out what's true.